Okay, so I got to see Supergirl this morning, afternoon. um, had some trouble in the theater about partway through. Uh, the movie froze, but fortunately, the theater people were nice about it. Uh, and film managed to make it through to its conclusion. One thing I'll note is that despite the fact, folks could have left about partway through, the folks that were in the theater stuck around for the rest of the film. It was, it's not a masterpiece, but I think we've become a bit spoiled when it comes to comic book movies. The way I would put it is this: you don't get great movies unless people are allowed to make good, imperfect movies. Because great movies are what happens when enough goes right in a good movie that the planets, the stars align, to use you know, pseudoscientific language. But really, you don't get. I mean, one thing I've had to learn as a person who's a bit on the spectrum is to accept a certain level of messiness in terms of success. You know, get because my instinct is I want to do everything right the first time. I don't like having to do trial and error. But over the decades, and I do mean decades of writing my own stories, I've come to learn that unless you get the chance to kind of, when you're writing a story, you're almost never going to get it right the first time. You'll get some good you know inspired moments, but never it rarely everything does rarely comes together in a satisfactory way on the first draft. The first draft is often just about getting something done, you know? And then after you've got something at least halfway formed, uh, then you can go back and say, okay, we're going to let's see what we can do with what we got here. I mean, I've learned that the reason why you plan a story, why you outline a story out, is so that you have that, you know, so that you can make a choice. You have that opportunity to make a choice because you have it. You're not. I guess it's a matter of brain bandwidth. You can only think of so much at at once at the same time, and so when you're doing that first draft, you're kind of putting together the big, you know, the superstructure of the story. But then when when you get that when you get that straight and you go back and you revisit what you had in the first place, then you can understand. Then you have some, then you're not just, trying to pull stuff out of the ether. You have subjects for your creativity. You can see where you went wrong. You can ask yourself, okay, how is this going to, how will changing this make a difference? You can find, okay, I don't think I need this. Let me take that out. I do think I need something here, so let me add this. Y- it- You know, creative choices, I think, work a lot better if you're not trying to create out of a vacuum. I think what the reflex when we first create out of a vacuum is to try and do things conventionally. I know there's a whole sort of mystique around grabbing stuff out of the ether, grabbing stuff out of nowhere, but I think that tends, for the most part, to lead to conventional choices because your brain goes to what you remember as opposed to working with what you have, you know, as opposed to asking, what does this mean? Asking, what does this evoke here? And how would changing this affect the meaning? And it's not just about, shaking. Um, I think there is too much emphasis these days about trying to defeat or live up to expectations. Uh, because either way, I think what people really need to do is to get out of the neighborhood of expectations, not to, to go into territory where it isn't really written. Okay. And for all its flaws, The Last Jedi, another example of a controversial movie, actually tried to sidestep what they were trying to do in some fashion. The Rather than kind of just, and I know there was a lot that he did that, basically violated expectations, like the lightsaber throw over the back of, over the shoulder. But it's like, I think about, you know, the passage in which he's describing the Force and the way he kind of had Luke describing the, the light and the dark. And it felt like somebody actually teaching somebody about the Force. And he was actually making points as a teacher. He had a dark point of view, but you know, he basically said, the Force isn't just the Jedi. The light side of the Force isn't just the Jedi any more than the dark side is just the Sith. To think that you need one or the other for either of them is vanity, he basically said. But it's, the writing in the film, I think if you really examine it, has people, there is some thinking going on about what actually went, has gone on during the course of the Star Wars saga. And I think there's something to be said about, I mean, as clumsily as I think it was handled. And I'd say this: if there is a flaw in Supergirl, it's how it's the writing around. I mean, some of the writing ideas are good. Like, okay, um, all the different ways in which they kind of inhibited Supergirl's powers, kind of forced her on the back foot. I mean, they made it to where the outcome was not as certain as it could be. But I think if there's a big flaw to the film, it is going to be in how they developed the main the main plot. But there is something else to the narrative that I think kind of redeems all that, and I think it constitutes the real story more than just the revenge plot. And it's it's kind of there under the surface that you see in, I'm not going to reveal too much. I'm not going to do too much spoilers, but there is a great deal of difference between how the story is presented in the 1984 Supergirl, where Kara is, you know, Kara is you know, she's from this sort of, isolated, you know, sort of city of Kryptonians that escaped. And as of the end of the film, I'm pretty sure that they're for the most part all round. Um, but the Kara Zor-El of this movie is not quite so lucky. Uh, but I won't go into that because I think it deserves to be seen for itself. But it's there's a great deal of survivor's guilt and a great deal of, I mean, I think the movie is at its best when it's not trying to take itself too seriously. But there are moments where when it's taking itself seriously, that it does a good job of kind of, you know, sketching out the character, sketching out, what she was about. And I think it gives more context to the Kryptonians. It doesn't take back the controversial sort of twist of Superman recently. It doesn't take that back, but I think it provides a sense that the they weren't expecting They weren't expecting, this is a different culture. This is a different sort of people, and that's the way many of the cultures that we came from. I mean, the direct progenitor of the United States of America is a monarchy, a constitutional monarchy at this point, but still kings and queens and aristocracy. But yeah, you get a bit more of a sense of um, who the Kryptonians were as people. You see them more in their natural element. You see more of their, them in sort of full costume. And very, um, there's a very, spiffy sort of special effects sequence around um, the creation of Supergirl's home city. Um, but what strikes me about it is, this there's more of a sense of her as an immigrant, you know, of her being, she made the journey as a teenager, essentially. She made the journey being being conscious of what she lost instead of looking back to instead of looking back to what uh you know towards something that was never part of her living memory. And I think there's a kind of I think this gets into the large, but let me I have a bad habit of sometimes drifting away from points as I make them. So let me go back to, the review and just tell you what I think. W- What I think is that this is a perfectly good second movie. This is not a terrible movie. This is a fun movie in many places. This is, there are situations that are decidedly adult in their outcome. The story does not spare the innocents all the time, but it has some, you know and I know people criticize the needle drop stuff. I know they criticize, the use of pop music and stuff like that. And all I can say is just if that's not your style, there are more operatic Snyderverse stuff. There's the old sort of John Williams scored stuff. If that is your deal, if you don't like it, don't. But if you want to enjoy yourself, I think it's, the songs are you know at worst they're kind of sonic wallpaper. At best, that they could be some pretty nifty choices. So, but really, I mean, they want to compare it to Guardians of the Galaxy. Well, it's going to have a similar style because guess who's producing it. But I sort of like that. You have plenty of different aliens and all sorts of different chaotic sort of things going on. it feels like an established civilization you know, galactic civilization, and that there are all kinds of different things going on, and that you actually have a, you know, that it's not simply, oh, the character lost her ship, so that means there's no way to get off the planet. Nope, nope. That's not going to be the main problem. And in fact, it kind of leads into some interesting things. But it's like, if you just sit back and, I mean, and also there's Lobo. Jason Momoa most definitely had fun playing Lobo. He's a deeply cynical, deeply nasty, but also funny as hell, sort of, sociopathic character. And, it's just great fun, watching him chew up the scenery. He does a fantastic job. Um, and if it's sort of like, there are certain actors who were born to play certain characters, and when you cast that particular actor as that particular character, it's basically, who else? Like, you know choosing Patrick Stewart to play Professor X. Um, James McAvoy later. Um, Choosing, let's see, Michael Fassbender, in the later movies, but pardon me, what's his name? I should know his name. The guy who played Gandalf. Let's see. Let me refresh my memory. I shouldn't be blanking on that. Ian McKellen. Ian McKellen was an inspired Magneto. I mean, and I say this as a fan of the original 1993 era, um, Saturday morning cartoon. It's like, you know, th- you have these people who just seem to effortlessly fill the character. One example being, I mean, if you want an example of a good casting that somehow transcends the dreck of the material, um, the casting of Wade Wilson, um, or whatever his name is, Deadpool. Uh, the casting of Ryan Reynolds as that character. The remark he makes in the elevator. You know, stuck in an elevator with five guys on high protein diets. Dreams can come true. Just that's sort of effortless smartassery. Uh, I became convinced that if they were gonna do a proper version of Deadpool instead of the mouth I don't know why they did the mouth covered zombie looking guy. I guess it just somebody was getting creative. But you cast that sort of person and you get and it's like effortless. And having Jason Momoa do um, Lobo was just chef's kiss, you know. And he looks like he's having the time of his life with the character, you know. So I mean that alone, just but the chaos in the fights is they've got some pretty good sort of smack arounds. This isn't it's sort of like that the Superman character isn't going to be the one who's going to be smacking people around, you know, folding them like lawn chairs, because he's not that kind of guy. And I appreciate having Superman not be that kind of guy because I grew up on the Christopher Reeves Superman, who who was the sort of guy who would just he would greet you on the on the side of the building while you were trying to cat burglar it. But you know, th- it's just it is the movie is for the most part trying to have fun, and I think and trying to make they're just even with the interruption that there was at the screening I attended, there was a sort of there was a sort you know there was a sort of energy to it that that kind of carried me through despite my reservations about a number of things. I think they did the I think part of if there was a flaw to the film basically, it's that a lot of it kind of feels like the escort mission in a video game, if you know what I mean. Which is to say that you have a very underpowered character who shouldn't be in combat at all. And that character is put right next to a very overpowered character who, you know, for whom the other character becomes sort of the load. And it's not that there isn't some nobility to the young lady character who's seeking revenge for her family, but I think making her somewhat more capable and just then cranking up how awful and troubling, how awful and how powerful the villain was, kind of cranking that up a bit, you know, just out of reach of this character would have made a lot of the conflict, I think, stronger. And that's the constructive criticism that I would offer. That having the character just be a weak, powerless girl, um, and having that kind of, I think sometimes you put your characters in a situation where they can't help but be annoying, and it's not their fault. As you know, it's not the actor's fault. It's it is in part the fault of trying to. The imbalance is too much. So what I would say is they should have had the other character just be marginally underneath the ability to kill that character, to get at that character. Just to have the character be capable of defending themselves, but in over their head nonetheless. And that way it doesn't feel like they absolutely shouldn't be in that situation, but instead that, okay, they you know they're just on the margin of not belonging in that situation, to where you can understand how the character might get a, sort of a, I need to do this, and I need to barrel off and try and cut this person down. It also kind of gives more credit to the character thinking that they could possibly take down the other character. You know, it's like, you know, you're not kind of feeling, okay, this character shouldn't, be able to do that. This character will have to have somebody else, you know, take care of that. So that's my main criticism. They should have made the central. They should have made the, I guess, the driving sort of, what you might call the MacGuffin character, or the, sort of the motivating character. They should have made that character just strong enough to where you could believe that they would think themselves capable of dealing with this, and just weak enough that that's not a terribly good idea, and thus you need Supergirl to stand, to come in and deal with it. So that's the extent of my criticism. But once you get past that, once you get into, sort of the situations that, kind of the conflicts along the way, the story does a good job of kind of mining the different sort of situations, putting characters in genuine sort of trouble spots that they can't easily get out of, giving them decent sort of moral dilemmas. And, for the most part, I'm going to say this, it's a good movie. It's a fun movie. That's my assessment of it. It's my subjective assessment. And I think you should realize that, there's always going to be a chunk of any storytelling, any movie, any book that exists here rather than in the text, rather than in the movie itself. But you're not going to catch all that if you go in with a whole bunch of expectations. And I think that's part of what's dragged down this movie. I think people are going to come back and say, "Oh, that was a that was a good movie." Yeah. Why is it considered a flop? Why this? The people are not going to, I think, it's it may not be, I don't think it will necessarily be high on the list of DC U films. Um it's probably going to be, but it's not going to be sort of a, it's not a, how did they think this was a good idea sort of fiasco along the lines of what I've heard about Folie à Deux, the second Joker film. Although I haven't seen that, so I'm not going to. But really, we're not talking about a total failure as a movie. There are some things that this movie gets fairly right. Okay, so that's gonna be my segue to talk about a problem that to talk about in general the problem of nostalgia, the problem of hindsight bias, as as um, far as films go. So it let me describe to you my childhood. The relevant parts. If we're talking superhero films, superhero media in general. I think the first really big superhero film that's not attached to some sort of TV series is Superman, the movie, 1978, year before I was born. But still, I grew up on the Christopher Reeve Superman, and that was basically the first superhero character that I saw in some sort of, in the movies, the cinematic big budget sort of movies. And so we had Superman the movie, and we had uh, the the subsequent sequels. Superman 2, of course, Neil before Zod. And then you had Superman 3. I vividly remember a number of things about Superman 3, one of which being the bad versus good Superman fight, which is an excellent sequence, by the way. You um, and then there is the part in the story where, and what really sticks in my younger memory is that nightmarish part where um, where and this is spoilers for an I think at this point over 40-year-old movie. There's a point at which the computer takes uh takes over one of the villain, the side villains. The main villain is an industrialist, I think played by Robert Vaughn. Um there is a side villain who I think is the main villain's sister, no, a middle-aged lady who gets, when they're fleeing from the computer, gets sucked back by the computer and turned into this sort of cyborg monster. And s- that was very scary, but also very cool. And I think this is something I think I know the standard sort of thing to say is that, oh, they love to scar kids, you know, for life in the movies in the 80s. And no, I don't think that was it. I think kids want to be a little afraid sometimes. They want to see scary things or gross things or horrible dangerous things happen. That's part of growing up, is learning to deal with the risky sort of situation that is the real world. The real world is not a safe place. It doesn't, I know I'm not trying to score cool, grim, dark points here by talking about how, oh, everything shouldn't have a trigger warning on it. But I think, I can understand that people don't want to have their traumas, you know, poked at. And, use the internet. If you're wanting to avoid movies that have particular triggers, or if you're wanting to manage your immersion, your handling. I mean, I had a recent experience I could not watch The Elephant Man all the way through. And part of it was because there was this character who just kept on bothering the title character, humiliating the title character by bringing people around to gawk at him. And he finally got to this point where he brought this mob of people around him, and the character shortly thereafter disappeared. And it was like I'm a person who dealt with an horrendous amount of bullying as a kid. Never, sort of, completely physically abusive, though I had my points where people tried to beat me up. Um, Fortunately, I sort of developed early, and as a result, I was physically larger and more powerful than the kids who might try to beat me up most of the time. Um, so it's like, but even so, it was the psychological sort of constant harassment, especially for somebody who, being on the spectrum, could not just simply let things roll off his back. Didn't have that ability to kind of, and still don't to extent now, have that ability to kind of let things roll off my back. So things kind of stuck, and I've never been very comfortable watching characters get humiliated in that sort of way, bullied in that sort of way. But I sort of progressively worked my way through it. But I think there's a certain extent to which we want to face our fears, that where we don't want to just avoid it at all costs. But I mean, I'll tell you something. One of the worst night terrors I ever had was a result of the series V. Um, in the series V, the and again, this is maybe spoilers, but it's spoilers for something over 40 years old. Uh, the villain characters are this race of reptilian aliens, but the aliens wear these sort of masks and wear sort of fake skin over their really scaly skin. And there was this scene I saw as a very young boy where the character was started to peel off their own skin and saw the reptilian skin underneath, the scales underneath. And I had a dream that I was doing exactly that. And it was, you know, one of the more, wild things. I think I ended up in the hall sort of screaming about that nightmare. But I think then there was a point at which um, I was watching some sort of music video or some sort of movie or something which was set in one of these dystopian futures or alien sort of sci-fi sort of setups. And there was this scene where this creature came, this sort of snake-like creature came, just rising out of the water at the hero character, and that deeply disturbed me at the time. And what my mother did is my mother reassured me that what that actually was a puppet. And once that sort of got into my head, once I understood sort of on on that level that what I was watching wasn't real, that they were making it up. Once I could understand that it was all pretend, then a switch flipped, and ever since then I've been kind of, you know, I've had a I'm the kid who I think by 1987, 1988, whatever the time was, late 80s, I was still a child, but I was able to watch at least the TV version of the TV edit of Hellraiser without having serious nightmares as a result, because I understood, you had, stop motion animation, you had the, you had the this, that, and the other. Um, but it's sort of like, I mean, there were still moments that disturbed me. Um, but it was sort of like, like I was much more able to absorb horror and things like that without feeling without feeling it too harshly. And so, and I'm not at all the sort of person who wants to deal with that sort of thing in real life, blood and guts and everything like that. Um, so, superhero movies. So let's go back again and kind of trace back because before 1989, which is a substantial amount of my childhood, before 1989, I can recall, um, well, Batman. What was Batman to a kid in the 80s? Let me tell you. Batman was na 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 Batman. It was Adam West and Burt Ward as Batman and Robin. That's what it was. A 1960s television series that for most children my age was on constant rotation as a syndicated rerun, and they had it, and for those who haven't had um the privilege to experience it, oh dear, there's a sort of a poke at it in the movie Batman Forever where they get to this artificial island, and Chris O'Donnell's Robin goes, "Holy sheet, holy rusted sheet metal, Batman!" And the audience laughs, and but it turns out it's literally holy rusted sheet metal. But that was that was sort of playing off the kind of jokes that they would make in the very campy, very kitschy sort of 1960s Batman series. And they have quite a lot of, th- you know, Batman isn't this armored sort. Ever since 1989, he's been this sort of armored sort of martial arts sort of you know you know. But in the 1960s, Batman, you never see a punchline. Instead, you see a screen graphic going bam, biff, buff, and it was very colorful. And the Rogues Gallery certainly got a workout, including the famous, Cesar Romero uh, Catwoman, not Joker. Um, and of course, there's Eartha Kitt, Julie Newmar, and all the different Catwomen. Burgess Meredith's Penguin. Burgess Meredith, he plays Rocky's trainer, and he also plays later one of the grumpy old men's fathers. And it's like, yeah, it just goes to show you the versatility of an actor. And of course, there's Frank Gorshin's Riddler, uh, which, to be honest, I like him better than I like him better than Jim Carrey's Riddler. Uh, but you know, the one I really like recently has been that Paul Dano Riddler because it really gets you in that. But anyways, you have the Rogues Gallery, and you have all sorts of you know they didn't spare a lot of they had more than their share of those sort of things. But this is what Batman was for most kids going up to about 1989. Um, and various other characters would have had their series. Wonder Woman had a series for a while. Um, there's a lot of superhero. I mean, this is where you get into Marvel. Boy, Marvel. When you hear that Spider-Man, Spider-Man does whatever a spider can. Um, when you hear that particular line, uh, that is from a TV series they did in the 1970s. They also did another TV series in the 1970s called The Incredible Hulk. And here is sort of something a lot of younger folks don't realize. Before there was an MCU, there was this, I think, the Trial of the Incredible Hulk, which featured a version of Thor, a version of Daredevil, and even a version of Kingpin, who was basically played by, I think, Paul Rice Davies. Yeah, Sala from Indiana Jones, and Gimli from Lord of the Rings. So, I and I remember distinctly, and this is spoilers for a 40-year-old thing, is that he gets away in this rooftop rocket ship on the end, and it's like, it's, but that tells you precisely where Marvel was for the most part. And if you wanted something that was more substantial, you'd had to wait to 1993. I mean, there was that one cinematic adaptation of a Marvel character back in 1986, which I didn't even realize at that point was a Marvel adaptation. I didn't realize Howard the Duck was a Marvel comic. uh, and I sort of liked the monster in at the end of that movie. It's, you know, say what you will about the how badly that film's written. When you're a kid, you're not a very good um, writing critic. But really, uh, there's a lot of um, Lovecraftian influence under the surface that really didn't get fully noticed and commented on until much later. But those dark overlords, or whatever you call them, were certainly from that sort of uh, ru- that from that sort of neighborhood. But still, there was, it isn't until I think DC had more luck going into in cinematic terms. DC had more luck. So they had you know certain comic book characters that were brought to the screen, like the Shadow, the Phantom, and I liked those movies. Actually, they were pretty decent movies. Um, it isn't, but if you had told me that they would be awarding a Academy Award or even just nominating somebody for an Academy Award for their performance as the Joker, I would have thought you were joking because that just wasn't the level at which movies were working at that time. Superhero movies at the very least. I mean, we have to face something about the modern sort of based on a graphic novel sort of sensibility is that it is only lately that the comic book art form has even remotely been accorded that kind of cultural cachet, that the comic book movie having that sort of soul, having that sort of level of writing, having that sort of complexity to it, and performance from the actors. It's just a recent thing. You have to understand. And so for the great deal, for a substantial portion of superhero films existence, the notion that every one of them would have to be this, awesome sort of, Oscar worthy thing, or that the writing would all have to be, you know, classic, and that wasn't really a threshold. I mean, there was some real stinkers. There was I don't remember what exactly it was called, the X Factor sort of thing. Um, but there was this attempted sort of a they had I think Sean Cassidy and it was Banshee, who had a decent role in that one um, one X-Men First Class movie. Um, but they also had well, again, they had Emma Frost, and they were leading a sort of a group of the mutants, and only this one was a big stinker. It was, just very poorly written, and you know, like failed pilot sort of level of writing, and that's what you get. That's what That was what was standard. So when folks complain about comic book movies being awful, particularly this one, I have to say, it just until you got the Nolan films, until you got Unbreakable. I think Unbreakable is one of those movies that kind of made superhero films more prestige in a certain way because of the way it kind of deconstructed and reconstructed the superhero myth, kind of starting from the basis of, okay, there is this guy, and he doesn't know it, but he's actually, for the most part, indestructible. And they built a very plausible seeming sort of story where the character could exist in our universe to a certain extent. And that is, I sort of think, the sort of vibe that kind of then got put into things like Batman Begins. I don't know whether it was convergent evolution or whether it traces back to that per se, but I think there was this sort of sense of okay, let's real worldize our superheroes a bit. So Batman's Batman becomes trained by a secret sect of ninjas, which makes a certain odd sort of sense. Um, and then you have the Joker be this you know, magnificently disturbed character, but this sort of anarchist with a pitch black sense of humor. But that's the thing. You got the beginning of that movie, and it's like a cross between Heat and a Batman film. And so it people wanted more sort of grounding, but all this, and we're forgetting what it all starts out from. If you asked somebody in, if you asked somebody in the late '90s, before say Blade came out, what superhero films, what their audience was, you'd get children to teens. You'd get a sort of um, you get a response that's basically centered on it being a juvenile thing. And it isn't until later that you get, comic book movies being treated more like any other sort of popular sort of medium and being the basis for, that you use that film, that sort of material as the basis for a serious film. And so I think at a certain point we've been spoiled by some of the quality of the superhero films that have come before, and we've kind of forgotten that a lot of that quality is that we're sort of kind of apologizing for the fact that we like this sort of beat 'em up, uh you know goofy sort of stuff. It's that's, I think, where nostalgia kind of kills us, because nostalgia is very much a selective sort of thing. Nostalgia is, you know, nostalgia, I think at the end of the day, benefits from a certain level of ignorance of what you're nostalgic about and the toxicity of it when it comes down to it is that you don't know everything that went into creating the situation as it was then. You don't know. I mean, part of it was a certain degree of relaxation that these original. There was more room to experiment. There was more room to do new things. There was also the fact that nobody had really done this, that it wasn't a standard practice to have, more than one character out of You'd have Batman, and Batman would be just the only superhero character in the film. You'd have Superman, and Superman would be the only superhero character in the film. And even with the X-Men, the X-Men would be there, but you wouldn't see the Avengers, you wouldn't see the Fantastic Four in the same movie with them. And so there's an extent to which it's like, okay, I like where this has gone. I like the fact that in this uh, Supergirl movie, Superman actually makes an appearance, you know, outside of a poster. I think is the extent of his showing up in that previous film. It's And so when people start beating up on films like Supergirl, I have to laugh. I really have to laugh because I've had an experience of how bad superhero movies can actually get, and this is nowhere close to the bottom. This is nowhere close to the worst you can possibly get, you know, and that's also a warning of a sort. Because if you want to create a new dark ages for, comic book, superhero movies, if you want to make it a seriously bad investment, have at it. But you're going to find that a lot of these projects don't get funded anymore, that they go into dormancy while the suits try to figure out what they're going to do with it. And that's the thing I would tell people. Be grateful for what you have. Be grateful that you can see a Green Lantern and Superman and a character like Mr. Terrific. I think the name is all in the same film. And Hawk Girl. I mean, you just couldn't imagine that happening with a Superman movie back in the 80s. You know, if they had managed that back in the 80s, uh, kids would have flipped their wigs because it was just they really could only do the one superhero character at a time, and that's how it was for most of superhero movie making. That's the big innovation, you could say, of the MCU, which is actually creating an environment where, well, for one thing, you have the right enough of the rights of the characters in one place to where the characters could interact in each other's movies, making them a larger, more cohesive cast of characters instead of just having, Spider-Man here and Venom there. I mean, or have this Spider-Man in a movie with these other superhero characters. But it's that's the one of the things I would tell people to appreciate, because as as much as you might not be satisfied or just completely overawed with some of the more recent MCU offerings, which I'm kind of behind on, you know, I, but really I think this sort of, when I start out with that premise that you have to allow. you have to be willing to allow a movie to be merely good in order to allow it to be, to become great. I think part of that is you want people relaxed. You want sort of, I think where they get into a bit of a problem is trying to cram a whole bunch of movies into the pipeline and just ignoring the fact that any sort of genre work, whether you're talking sci-fi, fantasy, anything where you're doing a lot of effects work, anything where you're doing a lot of production design, where you're doing a lot of sets and stuff like that, benefits from lead time. If you're always trying to cram things into a series of release dates, then you're going to create a situation where productivity in terms of volume of content undermines productivity in terms of the quality of it. But at the same time, on the audience side of things, I think whoever got the idea that you could just intensely criticize people into making excellent work, no, that's not that's not going to work. That's never going to work because you know I know this as a writer that it can be. I'm at my best when I do my writing. I'm at my best when I'm relaxed, when I can just, you know, take a little while and say, okay, so what am I doing here? What kind of situation am I writing my character into? And I think that when you can puzzle out those things, when you can do a first draft and then, kind of polish the ideas in a second draft, when you can kind of iterate things so that it's more polished. I mean, every time you do something that rushes things, it's like Matrix 2 and 3 versus the original. Matrix 1 was a well polished work. Matrix 2 and 3, I think, were rushed and it shows. Lucas, in his approach to the Star Wars films, he always gave them about 3 years in between. So you had 1999 for The Phantom Menace, you had 2002 for the Attack of the Clones, and you had 2005 for Revenge of the Sith. And you can see that in with the original trilogy, it was 1977 for A New Hope. It was 1980 for Empire Strikes Back, and it was 1983 for Return of the Jedi. See, you have that spacing there. When you have that kind of time to really work out and workshop the ideas, when you have also people keeping an eye on the bigger picture within the story universe. I think that's one of the things that really affected the sequel trilogies was that they rushed them into production because they wanted to get back their investment. But what they didn't really grasp, I think, was that the quality is important to how you make the money. So if you had a more cohesive story, if you weren't just trying to recapitulate the original trilogy, which was a mistake, I think, all around because ultimately it kind of, it's never good when you cancel out the happy ending of a set of characters. You want you want new trouble. You want new trouble to make your characters have to jump through the hoops. You want, new challenges and characters that remain developed. That's far more satisfying, I think, in the end than it's far more satisfying, I think, in the end than just trying to cycle back into the same stories over and over again. Because what people I don't think realize is that stories like that are strange loops. Now, what is a strange loop? A strange loop is an entangled hierarchy. It is you go from the top down to the bottom and affect things at the bottom, and the things at the bottom affect things up on top. And so you got this constant feedback loop, this constant sort of situation where even if you go to the same place again, you've changed the characters. So Luke Skywalker, you know, I mean, if you look at the way things were in the Force Awakens, and I'm not going to say that J.J. Abrams can't do good storytelling. He his stuff is honestly entertaining while you're in the moment. It's also got some relatively well written dialogue. Um, but where he kind of fails, I think, sometimes is like with the Force Awakens, he makes Luke Skywalker the MacGuffin, basically. The what everybody is at, who everybody is after, what they're trying to find, the guy they're trying to find, and at the end, you've got you know Luke in his robes on the planet, and I thought he had a certain '70s look to him, which I kind of dug. Um, and but really, you have him on that desert island, and you have him basically. Ray, the new female character, trying to hand him a lightsaber, and that's where we cut. And that's where the Last Jedi has to start from. But more than that, it has to start from a place Han Solo, where Han Solo basically was a smuggler again, where Leia is once again a part of some kind of rebellion. You know, file the serial numbers off, and you know, First Order becomes the Empire becomes the First Order. The rebellion becomes the Resistance, and I look at it, and it's like it sounds like a recapitulation until you realize that these characters, that you've ended up making, you know you have Luke Skywalker being playing the Obi-Wan and Yoda role, but If you look at that, that's the role of people whose institutions failed under them, who basically were running the Jedi Order, and the Jedi Order fails, collapses, and now he's screwed off to the butt end of the universe. So was that means something different from, oh, Luke Skywalker is still the bright and happy sort of optimistic character we knew. Well, that bright and happy character had their future ahead of them. This is a character who had that future ahead of them, and then that future collapsed. And there's a certain lesser sort of aspect of this for Han Solo and Princess Leia, or General Leia, as she's known at this point. So, by implication, you have written a tragic backstory, and they criticize Ryan Johnson for basically having come to the conclusion that the reason why he ultimately, he went back to the source to try and learn why everything failed, and just came to the conclusion that it just needed to go away. And I know that's dark. I know that kind of flies in the face of a lot of the optimism that Luke showed, but Ryan Johnson was sort of handed that. And then you have the rise of Skywalker, and that's where you really get the poison, not just the poison of nostalgia, but the poison of enforced nostalgia. It's like, I mean, you could have, what you really need to do of any bringing back of Palpatine is you really need to have foreshadowed it seriously. Somehow Palpatine returned is as much a statement about the way they organized the plot. There is precedent for it in the graphic novels of the extended universe. Palpatine did indeed return during the Dark Empire and Dark Empire 2 runs of of the Star Wars extended universe comic books, and Luke falls briefly to the dark side. The same Luke who was, you know, optimistically, protecting his, you know, trying to save his father, and he falls to the dark side here. So, but the real problem is that I think it was a blatant effort to try and mollify, appease a lot of these fun police culture wars sort of folks who, were, up in arms about how representative the cast was, who were up in arms about, you know, Mary Sue powers and things like that. And you just get this sort of very quick and choppy attempt to please everybody by just trying to make, write things as if it was the ultimate, Star Wars movie and failing because how can you write such a thing? All the Jedi, all the Sith, all the Jedi, reflect all the Sith's Force lightning on them. I'm not even gonna pretend like I'm going to keep, that spoiler secret. But it's like, it's one thing to declare something a. It's one thing to declare something a summation of everything. It's another thing to make people feel it. To feel that all the lessons and the knowledge of the Jedi have led to this moment, and to not just make it sort of a mugging for the camera of, you know, I guess what I'm trying to say here is that, it's one thing to sort of pretend like you can bring back the past. But the thing about bringing back the past is that a lot of the past has been swallowed up, destroyed, even swallowed up and destroyed by the very people who are trying to remake it again. They create the circumstances that destroy what they loved. And if that's not a good definition of hell, what is? Destroying what you love. And I think that's what can happen when we start getting too persnickety, when we start going, oh, I'm just going to watch this on home video. The folks pay attention to those signals. They pay attention to what does and does not win at the box office. And what you might think is, oh, I punish this, then I will send this particular signal to the folks. And the truth of the matter is, you don't actually send the signal you think you're sending. Um, Instead, you're kind of, the signal you're sending is that this is a minefield, that this is territory where if you invest a lot of money, it's going to flop. So that means, that's part of the reason why you didn't see a lot of sword and sandal films. The old sort of Roman or Greek epics. You didn't see a lot of those coming back into fashion until Gladiator revived the genre. And then you saw a whole bunch of them. And you didn't see a whole bunch of superhero films until, the MCU sort of, well, I mean, there were not so many superhero films after the first sort of generation of post Batman movies kind of flopped at the box office. It wasn't until Blade comes along and kind of demonstrates, oh, this can still work, and particularly with more adult content, that folks, start bringing in that stuff again. And then you get X-Men, and then you get Spider-Man, and then you get eventually the MCU. And it's just sort of, you get this progression, but in the process of creating this, I mean, okay, MCU made, team, superhero team movies more attractive to the bigwigs in the corporate offices. So what happens next? Well, people, it kind of loses its novelty. There's a culmination of this story, so a lot of the driving sort of interest kind of falls away. And it's like, okay. So these things come in waves, and sort of wanting to send messages by punishing certain movies or by, and it certainly doesn't help, I don't think, when you try and destroy a movie before it ever has a chance to be seen. I mean, my opinion about Supergirl is that it's a medium well done film, that it's a good movie, just not a great one. But if and that's going to be the fate of a lot of movies. The idea that every movie should be a super profitable hit out of the park, that every movie should be a peak experience, like that every movie should be a peak experience, like Avengers Endgame was. It at a certain point you can't make every experience a peak experience. Otherwise, it's a plateau experience. You know, everything is equally high, so nothing is particularly feels particularly high. You understand? So you need there to be movies that are relatively low stakes, like an Ant Man. You know, you need movies that are maybe relatively low budget. You know, you need movies that are merely good, that merely get the job done, and then but I think above all, I think I think what people want more of is they want to be able to go into these films and not feel like the plot beats are being checked off one by one. And I don't mean, that it has to all be super original, but you want to keep things happening during the course of the story that people were not thinking about coming in, weren't expecting to experience going in, but get the experience of nonetheless. I think that is what people are starving for, what they're really looking for. And the irony is, you're gonna get those moments every now and then if you allow them, if you kind of relax and look for them in a movie like Supergirl. You're gonna get those moments where it's just, they're just having a blast, putting together this thing with, you know, Lobo swinging around a hook, and it's here's the thing, and this is my attitude towards movie going in general, and I'm gonna cut things off at this point. But my attitude is I go to the movies to have fun, not to hate on things, not to heckle. I go to the movies because I want to enjoy that experience. And part of that enjoyment, I think, has always been a sort of, I relax, I let it come at me. I, I allow myself to be kind of open so that I pick up on exactly the how the storytellers are telling the story. And so that means I can take in the significance of those things without having my brain overloaded with expectations and this and that. I don't want it to be overloaded with expectations and this and that because that means I'm not experiencing the story in a more first-hand way. I'm experiencing the story through a lens of what somebody else experienced or whatever somebody else claims the experience is going to be. That's the thing. That's the thing. A lot of the criticism, a lot of the predictions that Supergirl would fail as a film, a lot of those just they just began months ago before there was even a finished film to speak of. And I think that's where you get into trouble with this whole antipus anticipatory, culture around things where you're being fed an interpretation of a work that doesn't even exist yet. You can say the same thing about. I mean, I cannot guarantee to you that the film, The Odyssey, which is coming out eventually in July, I think. I cannot guarantee you that at this point they're not still editing that movie, that they're not still working on the particulars of that movie. I don't know whether they have locked down a final edit. And in the end, it's the movie that's going to be the movie, not the trailer. If there's one thing that years of movie watching, and by that I mean between 1994 and 2002, I would say it was my habit to watch a movie, two movies every week going throughout that period. So that's about 8 years worth of near constant movie watching. So I saw a lot of what people call cult classics from Dark City to Austin Powers to Fight Club. I saw a lot of those things that other people didn't see in the theaters. I saw in the theaters. And I knew those things were something special before a lot of other people did. And that is one of the flaws I think in a lot of the market and wisdom of the crowds sort of philosophies that run the world these days. One of the problems is that there's a certain kind of ironic need for the crowdsourcing of all these things to start from crowd members who look at things for themselves and set the tone, set the overall understanding, um, for themselves. So I'm when I watch these movies, I often went alone. I didn't buy any concessions because I really couldn't afford them. Um, and I went on my bike. I think that's an important part because it sort of clears your head when you do exercise, and it also sort of relaxes you. So I came to a lot of these movies just in a relaxed state. And it's not. I say my mind's blank. I'm not really, but my my mind's open. I'm still going to be responding to things and thinking about things when I see them, but I'm not going to be sort of doing a whole lot of expectations sort of things, because I think that sort of kills it. I think that sort of kills your personal experience if you're too overloaded on expectations. You know, you want to have a certain amount of you want to be just there to take it in. And that way you can see the subtle things that the filmmaker is doing. You can see what they're trying to do. You can sense the direction they're taking a certain character. You can pick up on the little individual facts and figures and you know, little bits of information that the filmmaker is leaving all around for attentive audience members. And then you can ultimately decide for yourself what it is you saw. That instead of being on an internet forum and having somebody drill into your head again and again, you know, what this film's going to be, what it's going to be like, what it's going to feel like, and you know, it's going to be sort of like you're never going to really um, experience it for yourself. And that's the thing. That's the attitude I want to take into a film, and that's what I tried to do with Supergirl. I didn't go in unable to see the flaws in the film, but I also sort of, you know, if the character, if I didn't try and keep an ironic distance, I guess I could say. I didn't sort of try and stand off and be objective. People try and be objective with stuff that is by its very nature subjective. You cannot view a film objectively, no matter how hard you try. And I'm not saying that because you can't, you know, kind of calm yourself, center yourself, and just, you know, try and note where something is a bit annoying or try and note where, you know, what your responses are. I- I'm saying that because by default, you have your own experiences as a person. By default, you have a point of view, and the filmmaker has a point of view as well. And you might agree or disagree with the writer's choices. You might agree or disagree with how they do things. But you also might agree or disagree with what the viewer to the side is telling you. Agree or disagree to what even your best friend or your, you know, or whoever, what they think. So, really, what I'm counseling people to do with this film, just give it a chance. You don't have to fall in love with it if you don't want to. You're going to have a point of view on it. You're going to have an experience of it. And I think the point is to make that experience as much yours as possible. So you know, I don't think people should really be too let themselves to get too wrapped up in all these online discussions and forum stuff about this or that. It's really it doesn't improve your enjoyment. You know, if what you're afraid of is being the you know is being thought poorly of because you enjoyed a movie, you need to kind of develop a bit of a spine there so that you are, absorbing it to where you are just telling yourself, you know what? It's fiction. You know what? It's going to be something that people are going to have different opinions on because part of the process of storytelling is handing it over to another person's imagination to finish the work. So I guess that's the poison of nostalgia, I think, is we forget how many things are, we forget how things are made. We also sort of forget that there was a world before these things existed, that there wasn't always you know, movies that featured multiple superheroes. It's that you'd have one character's rights sold to one studio and another character's rights sold to another, and so on and so forth. So really, I think it's time for people to better appreciate having an individual experience instead of getting indoctrinated into somebody else's sort of orthodox view of what they should or should not feel or think or whatever. It's part of being free, I think, to come to your own decisions and conclusions. So, y'all have a nice night.